if you do enough drilling on the techniques, pretty soon you know the techniques, right? And so if you say, we're going to integrate this into our physical training every single day, and it's going to be different because the whole program is structured in a way that is conducive to what I'm talking about, right? So you can say, hey, today we're doing drill 3, tomorrow we're doing drill 2, the next day after that we're doing, competitive pummeling, the next day after that we're doing, fighting over handguns, the next day after that we're doing 3 rounds of live ground grappling or whatnot. So if you're doing that, everybody learns the program. Nice. Like everybody learns to fight, whether they want to or not, because the culture demands it, and pretty soon they all want to, right?
You're rolling in little components of it during other training.
Doing everything else, and so that's just the generic technique portion, right? So then the motivated people from that, they get, you have to set the culture, right? So the motivated people, they get things, as they do better, they get accolades. Those are informal competitions every day when we're rolling, but you also have formal competitions, right? So imagine the difference between an informal and formal competition, right? An informal competition is like the unit goes on a run. Okay, a formal competition is like the division championships. So the difference is, informal competitions, they demand competence of everyone. So that's what you build across the force, is everyone must be at least competent. Okay, but formal competitions, what they do is they breed excellence, because now you're giving people the chance to achieve, right? So imagine this, right? Any skill set that you can think of that human beings might have, when you think of the most skilled people at that, they're competitors. Right, and they got that skill set because they were driven by the competition to be the best at it, right? So you only get that by having formal competitions, okay? But if you only had formal competitions, so I work at West Point, as you guys know, and we're competition central, right? Like you imagine, universities have competitions in everything, right? So we have competitions. We have a boxing brigade boxing championship every year. So I ask all my students there, so what do you get out of the Brigade Boxing Championship? Right? And so if they were a fighter, then what they got out of it was that they got like a chance to achieve and a reason to achieve excellence in boxing. If they didn't have that championship, there'll be less boxing training going on the post, right? But imagine they weren't one of the competitors who were in the arena. What did they get out of it then? Well, entertainment maybe. But they also got something else, which was that they would have experts within their organization. So the best units in the world, the best military units in the world, if they want to shoot better, if they have money, they'll hire somebody who is a competitive shooter. So in the early days of when I was in the Ranger Regiment and we were coming up with how we would fight in close quarters battle and whatnot, we used to hire like the best action pistol guys in the world, like Rob Latham and Jerry Bernhardt and all those kind of guys. And so those guys don't know anything about tactics, right? And why are we hiring them? We're the warriors who go to war and shoot people and stuff, so we're hiring these guys who just shoot paper. Yeah, because they're really, really good, right? And they can improve you too. It's just like hiring a guy who's a UFC champion or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu champion or something like that. He's going to improve you because having him around. And so that's a benefit of the formal competitions, right? So you see what I mean, though, how we can use, we've only mentioned a couple, but there's, you spend the whole program is about understanding all those tools that you have at your disposal and levers you can pull to be able to change what's going on in your unit, change the value structure of the people within the unit to create the motivation that is required to get people where they know how to fight, right? So back to our, what does your average martial arts teacher know about that?
Very little.
Not a damn thing, right? Because they're used to training people who are self-motivated. So it's a different task, right? So now back to our let's get every cop trained in jiu-jitsu. How the hell's that going to happen, right? Listen, cops have unions, right? They have workman's comp, right? They're hourly employees in most organizations, right? So that means if you pull cops off the street to train a bunch of them, okay, first off, the organization has to pay them to be there, and they're paying them not to be out patrolling. So they don't want to do that any more than they have to, right? Because it costs money where they're not actually accomplishing the mission. And then, what if one of them gets hurt, or even fakes getting hurt, right? Next thing you know, you've got somebody on the payroll receiving workman's comp, one less person on the street. So now you're the administrator of a police organization. You're having to deal with the union who's like covering for guys who are like faking injuries and et cetera, and you're trying to balance See, it ain't going to happen.
Liabilities.
It's not going to happen because it's a completely naive scheme to just say, why don't we make them train jujitsu?
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Hasn't been well thought through.
yeah, it's completely naive, right? Like it's like it doesn't have anything to do with jujitsu, right?
Right.
It has everything to do with that. That's an entirely different problem than how you win fights.
Right.
So you can hire a guy who's expert at teaching you how to win fights, and he will fail because he doesn't know how to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had another piece of something that I think might be applicable that I'm a little curious if you think that this is. So like just the emotionality, a couple different things that, and we could say that other arts have this, but like any art where you have to learn your lessons through your body, like experiencing it, is a little different than learning it from a PowerPoint, right? So,
Well, I would say there's another component of learning when you're talking about learning things that are just knowledge-based or things that are skill-based.
yeah, okay. So if you, well, let me give you a concrete example
Okay.
to see what I'm talking about. So in mount training, and they might have a new term for it now. That
Still
I'm-
called mount
Okay.
or close quarters battle. You know.
Okay. You could over pursue, you could under pursue. So you can talk about violence of action is of course important, or you can be too aggressive and shoot someone that's a no shoot,
Sure.
right? And I can write that on the whiteboard for you and tell you about it, but it's different when you learn it in an actual activity.
It's
right?
definitely true.
And there's emotionality. We all know about the guy who passes guard with over pursuit
Yeah.
or under pursuit, or boxes with over pursuit and under pursuit. And when you pay by getting hit in the liver, or when you pay by getting guillotined, it's a different type of lesson than just a PowerPoint that says.
Yeah, my father
it's
used to
wrong.
say, that the best way to make that the best way to make someone into a man is blood boogers. Right? So, yeah, it is certainly true. You know, so we're mixing up a bunch of different kinds of learning here, but they're all related, right?
Okay.
So first thing is when you're trying to acquire a skill, you have the psychomotor learning process, right? So what percentage of teachers of any physical skill in America have any concept of what's going on with the psychomotor learning process and how human bodies and how human beings actually learn physical skills? Because that number is really, really low as well, right? Like so just so everybody, just so all the listeners will know from here on out, the psychomotor learning process is a 3-stage process. So the first phase is a cognitive phase. That's whenever you see the skill. So imagine we were trying to teach people how to play the violin or any physical skill, right? So the first thing we would do is show them, And so that could be watching YouTube, or it could be an instructor telling you or something like. What's going on though is that your prefrontal cortex is receiving the information through your eyes, and then it's trying to interpret it and tell your body how to emulate it, right? Okay, so that's what's going on in the psychomotor learning process. It's like the white belt stage, right? So remember back when you were training and you were thinking through the techniques as you were doing them. Step 1, step 2, step 3, in the way that the instructor told you to do it, right?
That's me.
Yeah, so that's the first phase, right? Well, and this is an important thing to know, right? So right when you're doing that, you're working in your working memory. That's the memory that, like, I just put that book down so I remember it, or I was getting a drink, and then you know what I mean? So your working memory, it's got a limited capacity. So you put that stuff in there, and then you start working into the second phase, which is called the associative phase. Okay, so the associative phase is when you start to take the knowledge that you have in your working memory, your short-term memory, and you start to put it into your long-term memory, okay? So that process is technically called encoding. You encode that information into your long-term memory, and that's what allows you to be able to recall it, okay? So the encoding process, I'll give you an example. So like when you were a kid and you were learning to play, learning to spell words, right? They give you a list of vocabulary words, and you're going to have spelling test on Friday, so you'd go home and write them all 75 times each. So that's rote memorization, and it's a way to encode information so that you could recall it later. It's also the least efficient way to do so. So you can do it, but it's like burning it into your head, and it doesn't burn very well, and it takes a lot of repetitions, okay? This is also the exact same thing you're doing when you learn a technique, okay? So you're in that cognitive phase at the beginning, and then you do it a whole lot of times, right? So you drill that technique again and again. It's just exactly the same process as writing down that spelling word again and again and again so you can recall it. Okay, so that's the least efficient way. Also, so if you want to make it more efficient, what you've got to do is start putting it more in context and start evolving more of your brain. So for example, if I say we're going to do a drill, and this drill is that you're going to escape the mount with the arm trap and roll, and you're going to come up inside somebody's guard. So as soon as you get there, you're going to make posture, and then you're going to do guard pass A, right? So that is going to put that posture and guard pass A in the context of that they will happen in the fight, right? So that guard pass is going to be learned better if you spend the time putting it in that context, those repetitions that you were doing, and so each time you're doing the escape the mount and then passing the guard, right? Because it's going to aid you in recall. So that moment when you actually do roll them out in a fight, you're going to then go to posture because you've already got it in context, right? It follows that move. And then you're going to start working on that guard pass because it follows that move, right?
So it's not in isolation by itself.
Correct.
It's associated in a network
Correct,
of
right?
ideas.
So exactly right. So then this, you can expand that idea even more, right? So the next idea is that you sort of build a blueprint around it, right? So I'll give you an example. So in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world, we have the hierarchy of position, right? So everybody in Jiu-Jitsu knows if you're asked people in Jiu-Jitsu, is it better to have somebody on rear mount or is it better to have them mounted on you? And almost everybody in Jiu-Jitsu knows, it's a little bit better to have them mounted on you. Okay, so is it better to have them mounted or in side control? So it's better to have them in side control. Is it better to have them in side control or to have them in your guard, right? So we know that. So all the way from the worst position, which is having somebody on your back, to the best position, which is being on somebody's back. That's the hierarchy of position, right? So what that hierarchy of position does is it orients you wherever you are in the fight, where you should be trying to go, right? What's the next place? From here, I'd like to go there. Okay, so Jiu-Jitsu people know that wherever they're at, this is where I should go, right? Now it doesn't hold true when you're two black belts fighting. But by then they're experts. But when you're teaching white belts, that is a memory aid to them, right? So then in cognitive theory or learning theory, that's called a schema. And it means that you give them this overarching idea where they can put those smaller groups like if I'm mounted, so I arm trap and roll, I come up in the guard, now I want to start passing the guard, right? So we said earlier, that's going to aid me in remembering those techniques. And then if I put them in that whole schema of the hierarchy of position, that's going to aid me in remembering all of my techniques because I'm going to have these little like cognitive cues that tell me, oh yeah, now remember this. You see what I mean? So that's why, for example, whenever you're teaching a class, you have to like bring that idea into the class at some point, or teaching a group of students. You have to bring those ideas in because it will make them remember the techniques better. So think about this, right? Like how many jiu-jitsu techniques do you know? Like it's a lot, right? Like I have no idea how many jiu-jitsu techniques I know. I have no clue, man. I've been studying jiu-jitsu for 25 years. Like it's a bunch, right? So how do I keep them straight? How do I remember them whenever it's time for them to be needed? Because they are in context. Right. When I find myself here, these are the things I do.
Right. Same as you don't know how many words you know.
Have no idea, right?
You could never make a list.
Right. And so see what I mean about the psychomotor learning process. So all that portion, that's a second phase, right? The associative phase. What we're doing is making associations with those knowledge, those little things that we learned in the cognitive phase so that we can put them in our long-term memory. Okay, so now we're finally getting to the third phase, right? The third phase is called the autonomic phase. So in the autonomic phase of psychomotor learning, that's whenever you learn it so deeply that it's going into your autonomic nervous system. Okay, so when you do a physical skill, what happens is that your neurons and your brain cells and all that are making pathways, making connections to tell the muscles and the bones and everything to do the right stuff, right? And the more you do it, the more practice you've got at it, the better those pathways become. And when you've done it enough times, then you don't have to think about it anymore. Right? So I always give the example in my classes, like walk across the stage, I'm like, that seemed pretty difficult, right? Took everybody in the class a year to learn how to do it. Right? So by the time you've been walking enough to be 25 years old, you're not thinking about walking when you're walking, right? It's no longer in your prefrontal cortex. It's deep down in your autonomic nervous system. That's the same part of your nervous system that handles regulation of your temperature and hunger. You know what I mean? You automatically do that stuff. So I'll give you an example. So whenever a hockey player's skating down the ice, right, and they're handling the puck, what are they thinking about? They're not thinking about skating.
Something other than the coordination they picked
That's
up
right.
a long time ago.
Yeah, they're probably not even thinking about handling the puck, right? What they're probably thinking about is tactics. Where are all the good guys? Where are all the bad guys? What play are we running? Et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's because they've put the skating and puck handling into their autonomic nervous system because they're all the way into that last phase.
Same way a high-level black belt can know he's up 6-4.
That's
in a
right.
match.
Yeah, if you watch the high-level guys going down, like every black belt, man, whenever guys have been training for 12, 15 years, he's not thinking of techniques in the way that white and blue and purple belts are thinking about techniques. He's just moving because the movement patterns. So jiu-jitsu is not a set of techniques, right? Jiu-jitsu is a movement pattern, the way you move in conflict with another human. The techniques are learning metaphors. We show you the technique because you're going to do this a bunch and it's going to start to make those pathways. And as we make this super complex set of pathways of motion in your brain, sooner or later, you just move.
Yeah. It'll
Right?
never even be exactly like how the geometry you're using to show it to the
Yeah, the
workout. It won't even be exactly
It won't
like
even be that. The techniques don't happen the way that. I mean, they do when you're fighting somebody you're better than, right? And you're like, okay, I'm going to do the,
You can literally put their arm there. And
yeah, I'm going to do the knee in the butt to break their legs open. I'm going to do the same side knee cut pass. My hand's going to go here. When you're fighting somebody you're way better than, you can go down just like that. But whenever you see two good people, it's not like that at all.
You gotta be in the flow state, I think.
Well, what I would say is that,
Best, maybe.
yeah, what I would say is that, and this is kind of a slightly different topic, is in up till purple belt, you're working on flow, okay? And let me take a second to make sure we're talking a clear distinction about. We're talking about athletic technique versus the psychological concept of flow state. So we could talk about more on that in a second, but this is a different thing, right? So what I mean now in the context of jiu-jitsu or fighting is that you are moving smoothly. You know, so when you watch two good purple belts roll, their move is beautiful, right? They know most of jiu-jitsu, and they're both about the same pace, and they're feeling the moves, and etc. When you watch two black belts roll, it's not like that anymore. And the reason it's not like that anymore is because they have added elements that the purple belts don't have, which is all about timing and pressure. You know what I mean? Like, so imagine, like a good example, right? Like you know when you fight a wrestler and they're like explosive. Well, when you fight a good black belt, they're explosive too, but in a more nuanced way, right? Like he might put, like imagine I'm trying to hold this tight, right? And the guy will push pressure like this, right? And as soon as he lets off pressure, I probably will too, because that's just the way a feel works. So he'll push, relax a little bit, then jab it through because it'll go, because that guy's going to relax there, right? So if you take that concept and add it to, that's just one little nuance, but if you add it to the way, the smooth knowledge of jiu-jitsu and all that purple belts are doing, you get a little bit different animal, and that's why the black belts can beat the purple belts, even though the purple belts know most of the techniques. Right. You know what I mean? And might even be better athletes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can come back later and talk about flow state. That's a whole different,
it's a little different
concept,
idea. I got a little bit of a gear shift I want to try to take with you and see if you want to chase it.
Okay.
So I want to ask you about warfare and humankind in general.
Okay, big topic.
Yeah, big topic. Big topic. So I think that there's a group of people, and the reason I want to ask you this is that I think you have some unique knowledge in this area, and because of some things I've seen you say in the past. So I think that there's a couple of different camps of humans, and there are some, as strange as it may seem to those of us who disagree with this orientation, who really do think that conflict or war or fighting is not intrinsic to.
They're wrong.
You didn't let me finish.
I thought it was going to be a long answer.
Yeah, they're wrong.
Next time.
Yeah. So human beings. Okay, so let me back up a step.
In our native state, we're not a peaceful, aboriginal,
Yeah, no,
beautiful.
we are. So human beings. Let me back up a step. Social animals arrange themselves into hierarchies. The reason they arrange themselves into hierarchies is because we're in competition for mates and resources.
Yeah, so this ties into the competition
Right.
thing from earlier.
Right. So that, many people have heard Dr. Jordan Peterson talk about the lobsters. If you haven't heard that, go listen to him. He's really smart. So, but it's not just lobsters. It's social species. But the lobster is a good example. So I'll go with that example too. So if you take two lobsters who've never seen another lobster in their life, two males, put them in a pen, what they will do is go through a ritual of fighting. So the ritual goes like this. The first thing they'll do is posture. A big posture, big claws. If one of them's way bigger than the other one, the little one will scurry away. They have established a hierarchy now, okay? If they're about the same size, they'll grab each other by the claws, try to flip each other over. They're wrestling, right? If one of them can flip the other one over, then the little one will, the one who gets flipped, scurry away. They've established a hierarchy, right? If they can't flip each other over, they'll back off, then they come back to fight. And now when they come back, they're trying to snip each other's eyes off and whatnot. It's a fight, right? Like trying to injure each other. Yeah. Okay, so the other two evolved because if that happens right at the beginning, then lobster number 3, who's not involved in the fight, might be the winner because he's the one who comes out with no damage, right? So that's why they have that ritual. So now that concept, that's male hierarchical fighting, right? That concept is in almost all social animals. That's how it plays out. I mean, you can see the exact same thing with crickets or, birds, or you can also see the UFC, and you can see two tough guys in a bar going through the exact same ritual, okay? So with that being said, and imagine, why do they fight? Why are the lobsters fighting? Well, the male lobsters are fighting over caves because female lobsters molt whenever they're having babies, right? So they're vulnerable. So they need a place to hide. So the male lobsters fight over the caves. So the girls are going for the guys who win in the hierarchical fighting because they have the bigger houses. So it's not actually different than the girl going for the guy with the big house and the Corvette, right? Like it's the same dynamic going on. Weird, and it's regulated by serotonin, right? Which is the same in the lobsters as it is in human, even though they don't really have brains, right? So and that's an important point. We can come back and talk about it. Like behavior comes before cognition, right? Crickets don't have brains, man, but they behave. So you do not need a brain to behave.
Right, they're not processing it through a frontal
And
lobe
we're
thoughts.
we're not actually either. We're behaving first, and then we're thinking thoughts about the behavior, right? And we can
script about the behavior.
and we can sort of modify the behavior with our prefrontal cortex. It's an aid. Our prefrontal cortex aids our hypothalamus. It serves our hypothalamus, right? The hypothalamus is your central old part of your brain where you get hunger and thirst and your sex drive and regulate your heart and right? That generates the desires that make you thirsty or hungry or sexy or etc. And then your prefrontal cortex helps them accomplish it. It's in the same sort of relationship that your cell phone serves your prefrontal cortex, right? Because you have a cell phone in your hand, you have better memory. You can navigate better. You right? It serves, but it's not in charge
It
of.
kind of goes through that filter from
Well,
your
so your
hypothalamus.
hypothalamus tells you you're hungry, right?
Now what are you gonna do?
So
with
now the prefrontal cortex says, "Man, we need to go get some food," and so, but it's doing what the hypothalamus told it to do, right? You ever like try to diet all day and then like you find yourself in the kitchen just mowing food, right? And you just can't stop, and you're like, "What the heck am I doing?" You know, like, well, you're not in charge of your brain, right? Your prefrontal cortex is not in charge. Your hypothalamus is in charge. It's going to make you eat.
Well, that's why we're smart enough to come up with weird justifications for that. Like,
Yeah.
like my dog doesn't have a justification. He just does it.
Yeah.
And he may look at me and like tuck his tail like, oh shit, I'm going to get yelled at because he can anticipate.
Well, so this is where we were talking about flow state, right? Animals live in flow state, right? So the difference between humans and animals is not our cognition in that we're so much smarter. The difference between humans and animals is that we can think in abstraction, which means we can recognize that there's a future. Okay, so recognizing that there's a future has a positive side and a negative side. The positive side is that you can prepare for the future. The negative side is anxiety, is the mechanism.
Yeah.
So the reason we prepare for the future is because we're anxious about it, right? Yeah. Okay, so animals don't have that. And they have it. Some of them can have it somewhat, but not in the way we do, right? So with that being said.
Dogs don't have a 401k.
So when you're in flow state, the psychological concept flow, that's like when you're skydiving or you're painting or you're playing music or you're grappling, right? So you're not thinking about whether or not your bills are going to get paid that month, right? You're in that moment living mentally exactly like animals do because you're not worried about the future. It doesn't exist. So that's what you get in flow state is. So positive psychology has three mechanisms, or has recognized three ways of getting genuine happiness, right? So one of them is savoring the moment. Like imagine that's like you're sitting there with your wife having a glass of wine. You're like, man, this is lovely. Look at the sunset. So capturing that is a skill set. You can be like, yeah, it's the old stop and smell the roses advice, right? That's actually a skill.
Thinking about the future at this moment. Or
Right.
I won't be.
Exactly. I'm enjoying this, right? So that's the first one. The second one is flow state. So flow state comes in a bunch of different ways. Like I said, skydiving, driving a tractor, there's lots of different ways where you can get in that groove where you're just all about it. Like I always give the joke whenever somebody's trying to break your arm, man, you are not thinking about your bills. So in grappling, we get that, right? So you're happy in that moment, right? But it's also the same reason why people do drugs, right? Because whenever you're freaking high as balls, you're not thinking about your rent. It's the same thing psychologically. So people do it for the same reasons. It's like momentary happiness, right? So both of those two methods are ephemeral, right? Like they only last for the moment that you're in them, right? And the last one is meaning. If you have a meaningful life, right? Then it's like the old joke it's not a joke, but the old statement. I think it was Nietzsche who said, if you have a big enough why, you can handle any how, right? Like so that's what that means. That's why suicide bombers kill themselves. It's because their why is really big. Yeah. So that's kind of an aside, but just so we kind of understand what we mean when we say flow. When you're in flow state, one of the appeals of grappling is the same appeal that people who do heroin have to that. Gives us flow state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's kind of a follow-on to my question about, our inherent.
Let me interrupt because
Yeah.
So we need a tangent NCO to keep me on track. Okay, so we talked about how humans, just like lobsters, have male hierarchical fighting, right?
Yep.
Okay, so there's hire's the wrong word. There are certain species who have adopted what are called scientifically male coalition reproductive strategies.
Okay.
Male coalition reproductive strategy means males form coalitions so that they can dominate resources. Okay, so for example, wolf packs, right?
Yep.
So in a wolf pack, they are a bond of people. Within the pack, they have male hierarchical fighting to see who the bosses are going to be, right?
Yep.
They also form smaller coalitions, so it's not pure. Like maybe you're the biggest, toughest one of us three, but if we form a coalition, we can dominate you, right? So that is all going on to figure out who is going to be in charge of the pack. But that pack, and it's going to go down the same way. Like we would try not to hurt each other in the same way that for the very same reasons that the lobsters wouldn't want to hurt each other, right? Because they would be worried about number 3. Yeah. Me and you mess each other up in competition for who's going to be the alpha, and he steps in unharmed, and he's the alpha, right? Yeah. So that goes on within the pack, okay? But more importantly, the pack is going to be at war with all other packs to dominate the resources. Okay, so that's hunting grounds, water, women, etc. Okay, so wolves, chimpanzees, hunter-gatherer humans, that's the way they live. Okay, so there's some super interesting, so there's a science called forensic anthropology that can tell, based upon people that they dig up and whatnot who are dead, what the rates of death are from various causes, right? So the rates for death from conspecific violence in hunter-gatherer humans are virtually the same as they are for wolves and chimpanzees, right? So we were never the peaceful savages. We were just like wolf packs, fighting it out over the terrain and women, right? And so now, this is actually what I'm writing about right now. So imagine that for a second, right? And also imagine what we were talking about earlier about how humans, we admire certain traits, and when we're playing role playing games, we're trying to act out the things we admire, right? So humans can think in abstraction. So we can start to imagine the person who has all these traits that we admire, right? Okay, so if you were to go to a group of hunter-gatherer humans or wolves who are at this constant state of warfare, and you were to see what they admire in each other, or what their image of the perfect person would be, that person would be warlike. Yeah. And the reason they would be because that culture has no use for a Gandhi, right? Because Gandhi's dead wood. We're at war here, and we need you to fight. Right? So they have iconography that's like, Thor. You know what I mean? Right. So if you look at the gods of those sort of cultures, you find warriors.
You would expect that.
Right, and that's just them. It's just like Disney making, animals with human traits, right? That's just them. Hey, Jen. So that let me give it a pause so you can. So that's just like Disney, putting human personalities behind animals, right? Humans, we create our iconography, right? This is where Carl Jung, I disagree with him slightly, but he thought that was innate in humans, right? But I think it's generated in some part by your culture because of what the cultural norms are, right? So with that being said, as that society changes, so too would these values, right? So imagine this. So if we had 100,000 years plus, all the way back to we were in trees when we were, hunter-gatherers, right? So then 10,000 years ago or so, we invented farming. So what happens with farming is, well, let me back up a step. Hold that thought, invented farming, right? Okay, wolf packs are optimized for war, not for hunting. So in my undergrad, my undergrad's in natural sciences, and I was studying. I was trying to go back and work in Africa where I could be involved in like predator reintroduction, right? So I studied the reintroduction of wolves into the Yellowstone quite a bit. And there's some really fabulous stuff about it. So one thing is that they have collared 3/5 of all the wolves born in that area since then. So they know what all the wolves do. Huh. Okay, so for example, the optimum number of wolves for hunting is 4 when you're talking about elk. It would be slightly different if it's different game, different terrain, but you get the idea, right? Yeah. Okay, so what that means is if you took a 5th wolf, right, then they would all get less to eat because it's a less efficient amount, right? But if 5 wolves come against 4, they'll win on a predictable rate. Okay, I think it's like 72% or something. But it's like they've got the data from all the wolf fights in Yellowstone. They know exactly how much they'll win. So they keep the 5th wolf, even though they all get less to eat, because they're more likely to dominate the terrain if they have them. Okay? So the same thing holds true for the 6th and the 7th and the 8th. And each as they go, they're getting less and less to eat, right? So at some point, they'll be too big for nutritional, so they won't be able to sustain themselves nutritionally, right?
Marginal returns,
right. But so they max out at like 25, 30, 32, depending on the terrain, right? And depending on the availability of food. So human Hunter-gatherers were the same way. In fact, our group size is around 150, right? Interestingly enough, in primates, there's a correlation between brain volume and the size of social groups, right? So, yeah, so monkeys.
People can't even remember.
Yeah, exactly right. So we are optimized for around 150 because that's about the size of coalitions we had in the hunter-gatherer era. So, but when we invented farming, what happened then was we got rid of that nutritional problem. So instead of being maxed out at 150 people, we could max out 1,500, 15,000, 150,000. We have 300 million people in America, right? 300 million plus in America, all in one coalition, because we have farming. Okay, so now what happens then is as you start to have farming, you start to have more and more specialization within your society. So remember the hunter-gatherers, they're all involved in war, right? But as soon as we specialize, then everybody's not involved in war anymore.
Someone's got to bake the bread now.
Right. So once we start to not all be involved in war, our morality starts to change because that iconography is generated by everybody's ideas of what's admirable, right? Pretty soon we have Gandhi, right? And interestingly enough, so what we start to have then is unrealistic morals, right? So in research about trauma like PTSD, right? So one of the largest causes we're figuring out now of what has been labeled in the past PTSD are actually moral injuries. So a moral injury is when you have a deeply held belief that gets destroyed by something you're part of or witness, right? Something you might have done, right? Okay, so for example, maybe you were taught your whole life that killing children just makes you a horrible person, right? So now you find yourself on the battlefield, and a guy runs out in front of the road. This actually happened in the fights in Somalia, right? Guy runs out in the road with an AK, you blast him. Another adult comes out to get the AK, you blast him. Then they send a 7-year-old. First thing he does is gets it, brings it back to a man. That man comes out trying to kill you again, so you kill him. Now when the 7-year-old comes out, you shoot him, because if you don't, you're probably going to die. So now you've shot a 7-year-old. Deal with that morally if you grew up in a peaceful society where killing children was, so that's just an example. There's many different kinds, but that's just an example. And so that moral injury, the problem isn't the war, right? Because wars are always going to be. We have always had them. We will always have them. Our coalitions will continue to fight over the resources forever. Mm-hmm. Darwin figured out quite some time ago that resources are finite, but procreation is not, right? It's exponential or potentially exponential. So that means we're going to have competition, and guess how it's going to be? Right? It's going to be violent we're going to max out our resources, and then we're going to fight over what's left, man. That's what animals do, and we're animals, right? So with that being said, I mean, there's more to it than that, but that's the big picture, right? So with that being said, we're going to continue to have wars, and we're going to continue to create trauma victims if our morality is unrealistic. Yeah. You know what I mean? So one of the things I tell people to do is imagine, where did you get your views of right and wrong from? Right? So most likely, just like the rest of us, you were raised by two parents who maybe never been to war, or maybe one of them did and never talked about it. And then you went to school, you had a guidance counselor and teachers and friends all in the same circumstance. Maybe you went to church, had a preacher, had Sunday school teachers, none of which had the first clue about what's really going on in the world, right? Yeah. And you got all your moral ideas, the foundational ideas, from them. And maybe they were clueless, right? Maybe they're just setting you up for failure because they didn't know. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. So back to our, peaceful savage thing. Yeah, it's bullshit. Yeah. Those people are full of beans, man.
It seems like a really hard thing. I don't know if you've encountered this. Probably so, but just as you were saying, so how do you re-educate people that are about to go into those situations?
Well, so the first thing I would say was among the Warrior Caste, right? So one of the ideas that I think is important to get across is this idea, right? So what does it mean to be a warrior for people like us, right? Like the three of us or the people we were training today or whatnot. What it really should mean is that everyone around you is safer because you're there, right? So you stand in the gap to protect them from the predators, right? So there's this analogy that gets beat around all the time, the a bunch of cops and whatnot. Let's do it. They call the sheepdog analogy, right? So the idea is that most people are sheep, and then some people are sheepdogs who protect them from the wolves, right? So the sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs, right? Okay, so the idea has utility. That's why it sticks around. It also makes the people who get to self-identify as sheepdogs feel better about themselves, so it sticks around for that reason too, right? But I would challenge you and say, why do sheepdogs protect sheep? Well, they don't give a crap about sheep. Sheepdogs would eat the sheep if there was no shepherd, right? So they love the shepherd, and that's why they protect the sheep. So there's a bit of a Christian analogy that really works, right? But what happens when the shepherd isn't around? What do the sheepdog do? They fuck with the sheep, right? So that's not necessarily the best analogy, right? I would say it's an elitist analogy because it makes you feel like you're better than the regular people, right? So here's a better analogy, right? Imagine a herd of Cape buffalo. And this will tie back into our moral injury thing. A herd of Cape buffalo, why did they protect the cows and calves? And even the calves in a herd, when a lion attacks them, right, they'll fight them off. Why do they do it? They love each other. That's a better analogy. And it involves everybody, right? So all of us have the responsibility to protect the herd, right? Yeah. To be the warrior in the room, as I always say, because at the end of the day, because I'm sitting here in this restaurant, the people around me are safer. Because if it goes down, I'm going to step up, right? In the meantime, I'm going to be over here chewing grass, right? Because I'm a buffalo in the herd, So and that, back to your positive psychology, sense of mission, right? Take that on as a sense of mission. Self-identify as a warrior. Be the warrior in the room. Be the one who's trained. Even if you're a pacifist, man, learn first aid. You're in there and there's a spree shooting that comes down. If you don't know how to help people who are wounded, well,
you're still being used.
It's a moral failing, right? Like, it's a moral failing to not be able to make the world a better place for the people around you.
Yeah. Cool. That actually kind of ties into one of the things that I was going to ask you as a follow-up about the intrinsic nature of conflict and violence stuff, is that, and I'm not even going to ask this in a leading way, I'm just going to make a statement, that I think that we are doing a disservice to young males in particular in our society if we try to just deny traits on a whole, that could be, instead of saying, use these traits in a only in their positive context, which is exactly what I think that you're doing with the Cape Buffalo analogy.
What I would say is that if we deny the truth, then we can't come up with solutions that work.
Okay.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? So we just had one of the experts about preventing sexual assault and sexual harassment in where I worked the other day, and she's a very smart person, and she had a lot of interesting things to say. But at the end of the day, I think she was unwilling to admit what human nature is. Yeah. There's a line in sociology there, social constructionism, and basically they think that everything is socially constructed. So there's a little bit of truth in that. And like we were talking about the iconography that comes from your society, right? But in the nurture nature thing, there's a pretty big nature component, right? And we're finding out that's true more and more all the time. And so I would say that step one is to take your ideological blinders off and look for the facts, and then you can come up potentially with things that will solve whatever problem is you're trying to solve. But if you can't do step one because you have ideological blinders on, well, then you're not going to come up with solutions, right? So that's one of the things, it was the social constructionists who said there was no difference between boys and girls except for the way we socialized them as they were growing up. And so let's have all these little boys play with dolls. So the little boys make guns out of them, right? Because at the end of the day, little boys and little girls are quite different. Now, they're not 100% different, right? It's an overlap, right? When you look at, if you look at the human traits, right, the distributions are more like that, right? So the most aggressive person is most likely a boy, and the most agreeable person is most likely a girl. And there's a whole bunch of people in the middle that are very similar and whatnot. But on the aggregate, right, those traits are associated with your biological sex, to a large enough degree that it is significant in our societies.
Yeah. Seems really hard to deny that once you have kids.
I think that's what happened. Was a lot of those people who were making those statements never had any children. I have 6 children. I can tell you that.
Boys are different.
Well, my 2 boys were quite different than my 4 girls. Yeah. Quite different in almost every way, right? And that's just anecdotal, but it stands. The research says basically the same thing cross-culturally. I heard mentioned recently there's been some pretty huge population-wide studies in Scandinavian countries that show that the more egalitarian the society is, the more people go towards what we used to think of as the roles that they were pushed into.
Right. Go more to the edges of the spectrum.
Yeah, for example, there are a smaller percentage of women in STEM fields in Scandinavian countries than there are in Morocco. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they can. Yeah. And when you give people their choices, they make choices
that they're more interested in.
What they're interested in.
They may not make choices in line with your ideology.
Right. Exactly right. They may just do what they want to do. Whole freedom things, craziness.
It's weird. It's really weird.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, cool. I've got one more question I want to.
All right, I probably have a brilliant answer. Let's try it.
Cool. It may not be a brilliant question.
All right, we'll see.
Okay, so back to kind of the warrior thing. I've got a phrase that I use to describe societies, and that is I picture that societies have to have walls and spears on their external side.
Sure.
Right, and it's similar to everything has to have some sort of structural integrity to it to keep anything of value inside. Right, your home. A cell.
Even the Garden of Eden had walls.
Yeah, there you go. So my skull, the brain
right.
is protected by some sort of structural integrity of some sort. So you're a guy who has spent a lot of time forming and maintaining those walls and spears, and also seeing the stuff on the other side of that. So I'm thinking maybe you have some thoughts about, and so the other side of what I say is that what we're protecting can fall under some of the categories of, I can't remember if it was Plato or Socrates that talked about the good, the beautiful, and the true, right? Because what's the point of having all the warrior stuff if you're not protecting something good, beautiful, true, right? Then we're just going around fighting, you said, over resources, right? But aren't we maintaining some good and beautiful and true things in life too, right?
Well, so we're also passing on our DNA.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So I'm going to give you a big answer,
okay.
Right? So the big answer is this. Our senses are calibrated to the time scales that are best for our DNA to push itself forward.
Okay.
Okay, so that doesn't mean that's the only calibration that could be.
Right.
So if you looked at the surface of the Earth and you were calibrated towards geologic time, mm-hmm. the undulations of the mountains would look like waves on the ocean.
Okay.
Okay, so if you bring that back into what it means to be, what those words you were saying mean, beautiful, true, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so true would probably mean in harmony with the way the world actually works.
Right.
So when we say something is true, it's like we have all this universe going on around us. And if you're a liar, what you're doing is putting something in there that's like the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why it doesn't work out. Right? And so what's beautiful? Well, beautiful really is the things that we value.
Yep.
Right? So why do you value a beautiful person of the opposite sex? Why? Well, because it's about procreation, right? You are genetically programmed to value the things that make you more likely to succeed in the competition so that you can procreate.
Right.
Right? Yeah, I hate to be biological, but man, we're animals.
Yeah.
You know, our brains are a product of, they're a biological product of evolution. Our thought patterns are a biological product of evolution. Our value systems, our stories, our everything about us, right? I took 2 classes in my undergraduate degree on population dynamics. One on human population dynamics and another one on population dynamics of all other species, right? Here's the most interesting thing. They're almost exactly the same. We like to think, so we have this hubris that we're different, right? That the rules that apply to field mice or whatever don't apply to us, but they mostly do, right? Like so our populations work in almost the same ways. You know, we're like a competitive hive species, right? Like our groups fight each other just like those wolf packs do, and we are fighting over resources, and we're doing it in ways that are not necessarily just overt conflict, but like migration is, et cetera, et cetera. And that is our DNA competing with all the other human DNA out there in order to be the ones that go forward. You know what I mean?
That makes sense. I mean, even something I was thinking of just now, to think of something that, like, that I think of as a beautiful thing, like, say, memories with your family.
Yeah.
You were talking earlier about being in the moment being one of the things in positive psychology for happiness. Well, doesn't that, if we become attuned to that, if I had no receptors or whatever it is for that would argue for, or that wouldn't reinforce, perpetuate familial life, right?
So why do you, as an independent organism, why do you suppose that your brain would tell you that those things are beautiful? Well, that's because that's the models you received for how to raise children, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the model you received that's most likely to push your DNA forward in time, right?
If I didn't value that, why would I
Right.
would be less likely to spend time with them and
Yeah, and we have all these crazy debates going on, and a whole lot of our political debates are just like science denial, right? Like, okay, so cross-culturally, for example, males, compete to form hierarchies, and then women select across and up, and men select across and down hierarchies, even to the point of what ages we select in our mates and whatnot, right? And look, there's a whole bunch to it, right? Like there are 3 human, and this is the portion of evolutionary psychology is very well developed, is the portion about sexual selection and whatnot. So, for example, males have 3 procreation strategies, male humans. Females have 2. Okay, so the male ones are pair up with a partner and raise children together. Okay, so that is the most sure thing. That's why we almost all try to do it, because it's the most likely to succeed that I will have at least a couple, 3 or 4 or 5 offspring that will survive and go on, because I'm going to take care of them their whole life, right? Or all the way through their childhood. Okay, so the next one is drive-bys, right? That's the dude just trying to sleep with as many girls as he can. It's also the dude who's cheating on his spouse, or it's the, hook up with a girl and take off, right? And the last one, which nobody wants to talk about, is rape, okay? So females have 2 strategies, okay? They don't have an equivalent to rape. They're just the victims of that. But their strategy for the first one is beauty. Like, we can all think of a woman who's beautiful but not sexy, right? Okay, so that is tuned towards pairing up with somebody to become a partner in life. Okay, that's why that's the sort of appeal. We can also think of a woman who's hot but not beautiful, right? So what she's advertising for is the drive-by, the short one. Now, here's the interesting thing. Like, we don't want to talk about this stuff, but it's true. So males of the species cannot ignore the hot one, right? Because the genetic payoff is so great. You can have literally 9,000 children as a male, because you can just go have, if you could get enough drive-bys, you could make that happen, right? So that's a gigantic payoff. And you don't even have to raise them. Yeah. There's it's the down with OPP thing, right? That's getting other people. You're like the bird that lays its egg in the other person's nest, so they raise your baby for you, right? That's what that strategy is about, right? So that's such a high payoff that males can't ignore it. Even if somebody who's listening to this is like, that's bullshit, I can ignore it. We all know as men he can't ignore the hot chick, right? So with that being said, in the modern world of advertising, that really works. So we are inundated by images of women that are just about hotness, which is actually advertising for the opposite of a long-term, committed relationship, right?
Yeah.
And then we're like aghast that people are just more and more that way all the time, right?
Well, and that's where also,
you know what I mean?
when you said an ideology that doesn't that denies that that's where that comes from,
Right.
is bound to be wrong.
Yeah, they can't come up with a solution, right? So I just read some good studies recently. So there's some good studies that show that if you have a disparity in the percentage of males and females, adults in a society, if you have a larger percentage of males, even just a few, percentage points, 2 or 3% more males, 52% males and 48% females, you have a rise in sexual assault that is correlated with that disparity, right? Well, imagine why.
Yeah.
Men are in competition for girls, right?
Right.
That's why everything in civilization was built by men so that they could compete for women, right? That's what's actually going on, right? And so then, with that being said, so there's a whole large percentage of men who never procreate.
Yep.
Now, almost every woman who wants to procreate does.
No problem.
Right, because they can get a man, mostly, and that's cross-cultural, right? But cross-culturally as well, there's a large percentage of men who don't. Can't because they're not competitive, right? So the only way that's ever going to change is if women start liking the guys that are bums living under the bridge, because those are the